The traveler drifted across open waters, the world wrapped in heavy, relentless fog. It pressed against his skin, curled into his boat, blurred the horizon until there was no clear sky, no clear sea, only a vast, shifting gray. At first, the traveler paddled with confidence, trusting his sense of direction. But soon, strange shapes began to loom in the mist. Towering cliffs, sinking ships, shadows that might be monsters or maybe nothing at all. Some were beautiful. Some stirred a flicker of worry. But none of them stayed for long. And then, faintly at first, the traveler heard voices. Soft echoes threading through the mist. Some voices sounded kind, others pulled at old fears. It was hard to tell which ones were real and which ones were just dreams carried on the fog. The traveler's heart beat a little faster. Should I turn? Should I flee? Should I push forward, maybe even faster? His thoughts swirled as thickly as the mist itself. Breathless and spinning, the traveler knew he couldn't chase every shadow. So he did the only thing he could. He set down the oars, he closed his eyes, and he began to hum. A low, steady vibration that grew and grew until it became something stronger. A deep, sure sound, almost like a foghorn cutting through the mist. He didn't hum to clear the fog, not to make the fears go away, but to remember the one thing that he could trust. His breath, his body, this small boat, and the moment he was in right now. The voices faded, the shapes softened, and through the swirling fog, a soft glow appeared. The sun was beginning to fight its way through. The traveler smiled. Not every thought needed to be followed. Some just needed to be met with a steady heart and a song. This is So What, Who Cares? With Lora and me, Jeff Kolaski. Join us as we explore practical insights for an impractical mind. So today, we are diving into the world of thoughts.
Yes.
Yes, thoughts. How they influence us, how they help us, how they can hurt us, and kind of how we foster a good relationship with our thoughts.
Ooh, I like that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Thank
good.
you.
Yeah, well done.
Our minds are constantly buzzing with these things that we call thoughts, right? Spelled THOUGHTS.
That's right.
The proper spelling of thoughts, right?
Yeah.
So, Lora, what are thoughts? Broadest question we've probably asked so far.
It's so broad. And people will spend their lifetime and have just studying thought, right? So the quick of it is just like the heart's busy beating, the mind is busy making thought. And sometimes, I guess, those thoughts can be active, and sometimes those thoughts can be passive.
There's a difference between an active and a passive thought. What does that look like?
Okay, so an active thought would be deliberate. There'd be choice, a willingness, agency. And passive thought is sort of that background, forward and back, time traveler. It's sort of that thing of where thought makes thought and it's happening in the background. That would be
Some
more.
thoughts make thought.
Yes, and some thoughts make action.
I learned that from you.
Yes, that's right.
I'm listening.
Oh, good. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. So where do thoughts come from? I mean, we've got this weird gray matter in our brain, right? That's shooting electricity in probably one of the most uncharted things that, we don't really know.
That's right, we don't.
Right.
And I'll probably get things wrong,
Yeah,
like
that's
about
all
what
right.
thought is, because that's what's cool about science.
Right.
Again,
Yeah.
will be updated soon.
But do we make our thoughts? I mean, some of this is probably going to go back to opinion or belief or religion, maybe, or, just.
Okay, so I think that's a good point, is some thoughts come from self, and some thought comes from the water we swim in, our familial upbringing. Some thought, some thinking comes from our culture, right? So not all thoughts are our own, even though a lot of times we'll assume that our thoughts are our own.
So we assume that, but that's not always the case.
Not always the case.
What
Sometimes you can even ask, like, is this thought mine? Here's an example.
Okay.
This would be like, oh, someone says, why don't you draw a picture? And I say, oh, in my mind, I'm terrible at drawing. I'm terrible at that. That's a thought. And then I could say, well, is that true? Or is that thought mine? And I could go, no, I actually remember a teacher saying to me, or, right? So some thoughts, now we're kind of getting into beliefs, right? But sometimes the narrative needs checked.
Do you believe, and it's okay if you don't want to answer that, but do you believe that there are thoughts that come from somewhere else that's not like a memory? Is there something in environment, in the world, the energies, the universe, whether it's a god or that's bringing us thoughts?
Okay,
If this is deeper than you want to go, or a different branch, then you just put me back on track. But
so some thought comes in words and some thoughts come in visualizations, if you will.
Okay.
I think you're speaking to this like thought being like an inner voice or an inner narrative, like when thought becomes narrative. So it kind of sounds to me like you're alluding to like that narrative voice as thought.
Maybe.
And maybe it's not the da 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 da, and it's more of like a whisper, right? If you want to call, I would use the language of like your heart thought or the heart mind. And that would have a different tone and cadence of thought. It would be more slow and whisper, or it'd be like the thought coming from your essence, different than the thought coming from up here. Yeah.
Less conscious and more.
Yeah, just different than when we think of thought that comes from mind. So if we imagine the hand in a puppet, sometimes we have thought and sometimes the thought has us, right? So a hand in a puppet, the hand has the puppet. Sometimes our thoughts have us.
I want to explore that a little bit.
Okay.
Sometimes our thoughts have us and sometimes we have a thought. So if I have a thought like, I'm a little bit hungry right now. That's a thought that I just had, right?
Okay.
Give me an example of what a thought, just so I can try to piece this together. If you have, what's a thought that might have me?
Okay, I'm going to go, I could riff on that. So that would be like, then you start to perseverate on it. You can't stop thinking about it. You actually are kind of panicking because it's going to be a couple hours before I get to eat. And I didn't even get to eat. Man, I never get to eat. And I'm so, okay. And then it's like da 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 da, like a looping thing. Or if I go to the whole, why don't you draw a picture? And I have a thought of, I'm not an artist. And then I start to, oh, I'm so bad at this. And I'm da da da. And now the thought has me. Instead of, oh, I'm not very good at that. I'll give it a shot.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. So hand in the puppet.
So sometimes it feels like we are making decisions or forming opinions on things based on incomplete information. Okay. how do you think missing data points affect kind of the way we interpret those thoughts and
Yes.
experience? And like, what are missing data?
Yeah.
Data?
Same. I don't know.
Data.
Tomato, tomato. I'd say like missing data points.
Mhm.
I use the language of data. So what missing data points means is when we don't have the whole story, we fill it in. And I actually wrote this down.
Okay.
So our listeners, and if you want to play along with me on this,
Yeah.
because this is for me was such a cool understanding of thought.
Okay.
So I'll just read this, and
Mhm.
what I want you to do is just notice. Okay. So John was on his way to school. He was worried about the math lesson. He was not sure he could control the class again today. It was not part of the janitor's job.
Hmm.
So, what did you notice about the visual thought you were having?
The internal story changed every line.
That's right. So, when we don't have the whole picture, our mind will fill in the blanks. And so missing data points means that we begin to fill in the blank, and the filling in often has to do, and this is where we go, is the thought my own, with what we're assuming, right? And so, or of our past experiences,
Right.
of our culture. So we with missing data points, the mind will want to fill in information.
Man, that can be so dangerous because
Yeah.
how often are things misinterpreted just based on that? Now, this goes into how we behave, how we treat those around us, how we interact with, a spouse or a friend or or even someone we don't like, just because I don't have the full story. When you said John was on his way to school, in my head, I'm seeing this little kid walking to school.
Of course.
But then John wasn't sure about the math lesson or whatever you said.
Yeah.
To me, that's still,
Yeah.
I was still tracking there. Still John on the way to take a math test. But then when you said he wasn't sure he could control the class, well, now John's a teacher driving to school.
Yeah.
And not being sure about the math
Yeah.
class is like being able to teach it.
Yeah. And then,
But then that's not the janitor's job. Well, now John is,
a janitor.
a janitor, and he is,
It speaks to also how we assume that the thoughts we have are one real and true. How quickly we assume every thought we have is true.
Why do we get so defensive when those thoughts are, or some people anyway, and it takes practice to not, but why does it feel so alarming when those things are challenged?
That is something outside of thought.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about thought, but I do want to like bookmark that to go deeper, because that defensive wound is so good to get into.
Because even, and we'll get back on track, but even the small things, I have a little bit of knowledge, so I build this story about it. And you come in and you give me new information that I didn't have that completely changes how it looks. Nothing is as insignificant to my life as John is now the teacher and not the kid.
Right.
But he wasn't anyway, but something that challenges what I thought about how my life is, or my trajectory, or your part of my life, or something like that. And then I go, no.
So this actually does play into why we're bringing thought up, because we want to be able to be flexible with thought. That doesn't mean like blowing in the wind and values, right?
Yeah.
It means that because I have this thought, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true for me or others. And how can I hold thoughts or view thoughts more like carbonation, like little bubbles, and let them move through, and let the thoughts become less about, because what happens is we have a thought, then we say, oh, this thought's true. And not only is this thought true, it's reflective of who I am. And now it is me. And now it becomes a whole thing. And so someone says that actually wasn't the story,
Right.
and updates it. And no.
Right.
Because we weren't able to hold that thought or see it as sort of like this bubble floating.
Right. And it seems like a lot of times in those situations when maybe we are missing data and we don't maybe know it, it kind of depends. We like to sometimes go toward the negative in those, we fill in the story negatively. Not everybody, not all the time. And I do notice that in a lot of times it does depend on my mood, how it's happening. If something's going on at work and I get this little piece of whatever, and I'm already frustrated and like, well, that person's probably just off doing their own thing like they always do, because they don't care about, and then all of a sudden we have negativity, and that negativity seems to stick so much harder than, so why do you think that our minds, so negativity bias, right?
Right.
Why do we stick so hard on that?
Isn't it funny? Like you bring up work and you're like, the thing happens at work and you never assume like, oh, it's actually going to be an amazing promotion.
Right. Yeah. Why am I getting called into this meeting? Like,
yes.
This is a meeting that came out of nowhere. I'm probably getting fired.
Yeah. But we don't move to, this is going to be an awesome meeting, because we're actually wired for this thing ancestrally, called a negativity bias. And what that means is, if you could imagine our ancestors walking, they see a snake. Well, they see a stick. They assume it's a stick. It's not a stick. It's a snake. It kills the food giver. Oh, so now I have to be on the lookout for
all sticks.
All sticks. Yeah, because sticks can be snakes. So the negativity bias like kept us alive, and now here we are. And again, they'd say like this is the first time in our history of being able to override the negativity bias, or we go, oh, this is me assuming the worst case scenario. It's me assuming snakes when it sticks. Okay. Caught it. So we're able to do that now where before we couldn't.
Why is now the first time that we can do that?
Brain's evolving, baby.
Okay.
It's great. And when I say now, I mean, I'm speaking in the last, we're talking like thousands of years, right? So it's not like in the last 2 years we can do it.
I knew my grandpa wasn't good at it.
No, it's not. We're not talking recent in the last year.
And the way we overcome that, positive thinking?
No. Well, and personally, I was like super into affirmations, and then I learned some information around this thing called positivity kickback, and it made a lot of sense for me. And I kind of swung the pendulum the opposite way. I was like, I'm not thinking positive ever again. So I'm not saying that in this bit of information, but the kickback is if the thought says you're going in to get fired, or the thought is, I'm so broke. Right. And then we say, well, let's do affirmations, or let's practice positive thinking. And we go, I'm getting a promotion. Then the next thought is this kickback effect, which will be like, no, you're not. Or if the affirmation is, I'm rich and wealthy. And then the mind will be
you're
like, I saw your bank account. Like, no, you're not.
I just saw that overdraft come through. You are not.
Right. So we get in this like back and forth.
Well, does this introduce, I know you're not a fan of the word toxic because of how.
No, I know. I mean, there is toxic positivity.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
where oh, things are awful, but just feel, if you just smile and you just, all you have to do, just,
think positive.
Think positively.
Yeah.
That feels gross. That feels real gross. That doesn't mean that I don't believe that having a more optimistic outlook about things hasn't helped me in certain things. But there is a level where I feel like it's probably too far.
Okay. So, extremes, right? So, I had these affirmations all over my house, and then I learned this information. I was like, oh yeah, this is why that's not working like that. Cause now I'm in the battle of it is or it isn't. But we don't want to throw out the ability to work with our thoughts and even turn on some positive outlook. So toxic positivity is more of like this cultural effect of like avoiding the thing that's happening that's harming people. I'm saying what we could learn to do is be with what's harming, and be able to be with the uncomfortable stuff, to see it, to take right action. But to take right action, if we're like looping and reeling out and not able to like be with ourselves, that's what, do you get what
Where it
I'm
gets
saying?
dangerous. Yeah. Because
Yeah.
then you're not being true to
Yeah. Like,
what's happening. And
right. Delusional, right? We don't want to go into delusional
Right.
rose-colored glasses.
Right.
And we don't want to go so far into every thought we have as true, every negative thing, all those negative loops. We do want to interrupt it.
We want some balance there.
Yeah.
We want some, there's a lot of times too when with, negative thinking and with positive thinking, well, mostly with negative thinking where you, instead of saying, well, I'm not negative, I'm just real.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What would you say to that?
I love this. This is so good because we do work like this is true. Okay. So I would say how you know is to check in with yourself. If your thinking is causing chronic distress, if you're in a state of fight, flight, freeze all the time, or more because of this being real thing, right? How is it fostering your relationships? Are you connected to yourself and to others? Are you building community? This is being real, really being real, right?
Right.
And again, it's not the Pollyanna view of like it's all good all the time, but it's saying like if I can interrupt and resource myself into the present moment, interrupt the loop of being real, air quotes, and offer myself a little bit of compassion or even a check. Like, is that actually happening?
Right.
Is that a true story?
Right. Are those my thoughts?
Are those my thoughts?
Right. How do those contribute to how we're suffering day in, day out?
I mean, without a doubt, a lot of us, our suffering is related to how tightly we hold our thoughts.
Okay. So I've noticed in people around me or in myself, I've heard referred to and what I refer to as like spiraling, right? You mentioned like, how did you say it?
Mind looping.
Yeah, looping. Sometimes one thought leads to another, and before we know it, we feel even worse. And what is that? Like, how does you said it's how tightly we hold our thoughts. Can you speak to that and like what that really means?
So that's kind of like back at that, like the puppet in the hand. It's like the thought has the person now. When we're doom casting, when we're like
you call it storytelling.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes I call it storytelling, or sometimes it's just a way of hypnotizing yourself. I'll call it like, it's a little self-hypnosis, right? With this thought thing, because it's one thing to have a thought, but when we start spiraling, now we're also engaging in emotion, we're engaging in sensation, it becomes a whole nother thing. Not just a thought having a thought.
Right.
It's, and it can become really detrimental to not just being in the present moment. We can't live in the present moment all the time, but it becomes detrimental to our health and our well-being and some of those things I had mentioned before. It's also part of the human experience. Right. So if you're having it, if it's happened to you, if you've experienced it, there's never going to be a time where we're not having thought. We have minds that will be thinking.
Okay, so I want to tell a little bit of a story, and it kind of leads to something that you mentioned in our pre-production. So when you say we're not ever going to have thoughts, right? So back a long time ago, and this is a story for another time, but I had what I call some darkness in my life as a child, and what I learned to do, and I had trouble sleeping. So I had trouble getting myself to sleep, and what I learned to do was I would close my eyes and I would try to hide all thoughts from coming in. So if you imagine a field of black, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see nothing but black. And every thought that I had, every word, whether it was as silly as, am I thinking about this thought? Or if it was as, something that I ate earlier or whatever, any thought that came in was either an image or a word that came into that black field. And my job was almost a game, was to take it and push it away, push it out of that black field. I wanted nothing but a black field, right? And it would sometimes come up from the bottom and I'd push it down. And it would sometimes come up from the top corner and I'd push it back up. And I would do that. And eventually, because my goal was to have no thoughts. I didn't know what I was doing at the time.
I love this.
Right?
Yeah.
And obviously the goal was to just make me go to sleep. And it worked.
Yeah.
It eventually worked. I stopped thinking about what I was thinking about and it let me go to sleep. What I've heard now is it was a form of meditation that I was doing and I didn't even probably realize it. Does meditation, first of all, I guess, what's your reaction to that? What was I doing?
Well, I think that you were being brilliant and problem solving something. And I have a lot of well done on little Jeff for doing that because he knew it was important to get to sleep. Mm-hmm. And also, and this isn't a thing against your parents or where my parents didn't meet needs, but when we have to sort of come up with our own solution, like no adult present to be like, hey, bud, what's going on? Mm-hmm. Right. So well done.
Thanks.
And
little Jeff says thanks.
Yeah, little Jeff did a good job. And in a quite brilliant way it is. It can, so there is meditation. So no thought mind. So there's a couple thoughts I'm having here. Mm-hmm. One, we have to be, now you're an adult. Mm-hmm. So now we go, okay, so there's a big difference between taking a chunk of time and dedicating it to meditation and working with as thoughts come, they disappear, which is what you were doing, but with like Atari vision, right? Mm-hmm. That's my generation, I guess, not me, yours, right?
It's
Atari.
Exactly what it looked like in my head. It was 8-bit at most.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So well done. Yeah. You intuitively somehow, and it's in you, this knowledge to meditate. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between meditating and learning how to not even just, so that's different than being with thought. Mm-hmm. So here's the thought and I'm going to learn how to hold it compassionately, more like mindful meditation. What you were doing was more of this other practice of no thought, right. And where it's like, okay, now it's moving by, right? Like a waterfall just keeps coming and it keeps moving. Sometimes I'll grip it and get caught, but whoop, I'm going to move it by. There's a difference between that and suppression of thought. Mm-hmm. So now we go like, oh yeah. So can I work with some of these more difficult thoughts? Can I learn how I would suppress thought or thought being narratives or visuals? And I can learn to be with some more difficult thought processes or visual thinking things, right? Mm-hmm. And still hold lightly. Mm-hmm. So not suppressing. Do you get what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. At the time, of course, it was suppress, because I just want to go to sleep and I don't want to be thinking about what I'm thinking about and whatnot. So it worked at the time, but I definitely hear what you're saying. And go ahead.
Okay. So what I was going to say is, and well done, because we need to sleep.
Yeah.
And I would say how a lot of people, what happens is we stop being busy and we lay down and then the thoughts start to come. And so it's not an unusual experience that you had this at night. And I think a lot of people speak to having it at night, but we actually can have it in the morning too, where we wake up, and some people wake up, and I use the language herkle-durkle, where you just kind of lay around, and some people wake up and they're like right into that
Let's
thought.
do it.
Yeah. And it's like thought. And so busyness has to get moving. We got to start busying the body. So that kind of looping thought can happen often before we go to bed, and it does happen when we wake up too. And so how we learn to be with that.
Right. So meditation is not to get us to stop thinking about these things generally, correct?
Yeah. I mean, it is a training of awareness, of kind attention.
Right.
Right. So
how would you then, I like to end our episodes with something we talked about and some kind of a tool that someone can use, even if it's just very base level. But since we're talking about meditation and all that, what's a mindfulness or a meditation practice that you would maybe give somebody to help them maybe sit with those thoughts? And do you have something that you can maybe share with the listeners?
So this is just kind of quick, but
yeah,
I have a couple things. So meditation is single point focused, right? Mindfulness is kind of present moment awareness with this compassionate gaze, holding lightly. Those practices are great tools. They're just a couple tools, and they may not work for everyone.
Right.
So what I would offer is something a bit different, which
Please.
Doesn't really fall into meditation or mindfulness.
That's fine.
But I would say humming, like, right? So when we engage our senses, that is something that will help to shift thought. So put on an album you really love. But really, if I were to say one thing that's kind of a quick and fast of like, I'm looping, I'm starting to kind of do that thing, start to hum.
Is humming, is that specific, or is singing or whistling, or do those do the same thing? Or does humming have something because of, if I'm getting too woo-woo here, you tell me, but because of vibrations and things like that?
Okay, so this is going to go a little longer because it is interesting. We have this cranial nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, that travels down our cheek and down our throat, scans the lungs and the belly, checks in, sends a message back up that says, hey, are we okay? Right? So there's this thing called polyvagal theory. So this nerve, when we hum, vibrates, right? And that vibration does soothe our sense or give a message of like, yeah, hey, we're good, we're cool.
That's why I was wondering. I had a feeling that humming specifically had something special to it, as opposed to any other form of, it's not just musical expression necessarily, which has a good place
and it
in
does.
our life.
Yeah,
but,
it does for sure.
Yeah.
But humming and thinking, it's hard to do the both at the same time. It's hard to mind. So there is a vibrational thing, but I'm speaking more towards how humming and looping are difficult to do together. There's a few other, there's lots of other tools too, but that's a good one.
As the traveler sailed on, the fog remained. He moved through it with steady breath and steady hands, no longer pulled by every illusion. And now, when voices and shadows appeared, he answered with a hum, a sound that kept him steady and carried him onward.